Welcome to Tell Me More Stories Told Us podcast.
Great to be here.
Today we're venturing into a really complex and frankly quite shadowy corner of recent history.
We are indeed.
It's a story packed with secret operations, deep historical grievances, international incidents. It's the story of the Armenian Secret Army for the Liberation of Armenia. You probably know it as ASALA.
Exactly. And forget dry history books. We're going to try and unpack this like the real-life thriller it often resembles.
So we're looking at ASALA, this militant group active mainly from, 1975 into the early 90s?
That's the core period, yes. Our goal today is really to understand where they came from, what truly drove them, and maybe surprisingly for some, the ripple effects they had across the globe.
And we're piecing this together from historical accounts, reports on their actions, their stated aims, trying to get a full picture.
Yeah, it's a complex narrative, definitely some twists and turns.
Okay, let's kick things off right at the beginning, because you really can't understand ASALA without understanding the immense weight of history behind it, can you?
Absolutely not. The roots run incredibly deep, right back to the Armenian Genocide of 1915-1916.
Can you just briefly set the scene on that? It's fundamental here.
It is. During World War I, the Ottoman Empire carried out systematic killings and deportations of its Armenian population. The widely accepted figure is around 1.5 million Armenians perished.
A devastating event.
Immense. And crucial to this story, Turkey, the successor state to the Ottoman Empire, continues to deny that this constituted genocide.
And that denial, that lack of recognition, that's key, isn't it?
It's absolutely central. For decades after the genocide, Armenian communities around the world, the diaspora, they lobbied, they campaigned for international recognition, for acknowledgement from Turkey.
But largely without success.
Largely met with, silence or outright denial. This created a profound sense of injustice, a feeling that history hadn't been reckoned with. And that frustration really started to fester, particularly among younger generations born in the diaspora.
So you have this inherited trauma combined with this ongoing denial.
Exactly. It's a potent mix. It really highlights how unresolved historical wounds can become this powerful engine for radical action down the line.
And there was a specific moment, wasn't there, in 1973 that's often seen as a sort of catalyst?
Yes, that's the assassination of 2 Turkish diplomats in Los Angeles. The perpetrator was an elderly Armenian man, Korkan Yanigyan, himself a survivor of the genocide.
An elderly survivor taking such drastic action.
It sent shockwaves. While it was the act of one individual, many saw it as breaking a long silence, a sort of violent punctuation mark saying, "We haven't forgotten and we demand to be heard."
A desperate act born from decades of frustration.
Precisely. And it definitely resonated.
So just 2 years after that, in 1975, ASALA formally emerges. Where and how did that happen?
They formed in Beirut, Lebanon. And you have to remember the context. 1975, Beirut is descending into a brutal civil war. It's chaotic.
A place where groups like this could perhaps operate more easily.
Well, certainly with less scrutiny than elsewhere. The key founders were Hagop Hagopian and Kevork Ejemian. And significantly, they reportedly received support, training, resources from Palestinian groups active in Lebanon at the time, like the PLO.
That connection is interesting.
It is. And initially, they even called themselves the Prisoner Korkan Yanigyan Group, directly linking their formation to that 1973 event we just discussed.
Wow, so they explicitly invoked his name. That's powerful symbolism.
Absolutely. It anchored their mission in that act of defiance and remembrance.
And who were the people joining ASALA? What was their profile?
Primarily, they were younger Lebanese-born Armenians, people whose families had perhaps fled the genocide, who grew up hearing the stories, feeling that sense of injustice.
The diaspora generation.
Exactly. And ideologically, they leaned heavily towards the left: Marxism, Leninism, revolutionary socialism. They framed their struggle in terms of anti-imperialism.
So it wasn't just nationalism.
No, it was intertwined with this leftist ideology. They were very critical of the older, more established Armenian political parties and the diaspora groups like the Dashnaks. They saw them as, ineffective, too conservative, too slow, unable to achieve results through diplomacy.
They felt a more radical approach was needed.
Definitely. Their main leadership body, their sort of command structure, was known as the General Command of the People of Armenia, often shortened to VAN.
Okay. And there's this interesting detail, almost a fun fact if the subject weren't so serious. The timing of their formation in 1975.
Ah, yes. Some historians and sources suggest it wasn't accidental. 1972 marked the 60th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide.
So founding the group on that specific anniversary?
If intentional, it adds another layer of symbolic meaning. It would underscore just how central historical memory was to their entire project. It wasn't just politics. It was about settling a historical score, righting a perceived wrong.
A very deliberate echo of the past. Okay, let's dig into their specific political objectives then. What was ASALA actually trying to achieve beyond just, making noise?
Their goals were pretty clearly defined and quite ambitious. First and foremost, compel Turkey to publicly acknowledge its responsibility for the Armenian genocide. Recognition, yes. And linked to that, demand reparations for the victims and their descendants.
Okay, acknowledgement and reparations. What else?
The second major pillar was territorial. They aimed for the creation of a united Armenia.
United Armenia. What did that entail?
This was a vision of a larger Armenian state. It would include the territory of what was then Soviet Armenia, but also large parts of eastern Turkey areas historically populated by Armenians before 1915, often referred to as the Six Vilayets, or provinces of the Ottoman Empire.
So a significant redrawing of the map.
Huge. And this ties into another concept they invoked, Wilsonian Armenia.
Wilsonian Armenia. That refers to U.S. President Woodrow Wilson.
Correct. After World War I, in the 1920 Treaty of Sèvres, which was actually never ratified, never fully implemented, President Wilson proposed boundaries for an independent Armenia that were much larger than what eventually materialized. ASALA essentially wanted to claim that territory outlined decades earlier.
So historical grievance, financial claims, and major territorial ambitions. Quite a package.
A very radical package. And their politics also fit into the Cold War dynamic.
How so?
They explicitly expressed support for the Soviet Union. They saw the USSR, perhaps somewhat idealistically, as a potential ally against what they termed Turkish colonialism. They hoped to rally support from other Soviet republics, too.
And their ideology, you mentioned Marxism-Leninism.
Yes, their stated objectives included ending Turkish colonialism, as they saw it, through revolutionary violence, attacking representatives and institutions of Turkey, but also attacking countries seen as supporting Turkey, and ultimately establishing scientific socialism as the political system for this future united Armenia.
It's a potent brew. Historical trauma, nationalism, territorial claims, leftist revolution.
Absolutely. And it's worth noting, this connection wasn't lost on international observers. Even the U.S. State Department, under President Reagan, explicitly linked ASALA's campaign of violence to Turkey's ongoing denial of the genocide.
So even governments condemning the attacks acknowledged the underlying cause.
The context was understood, even if the methods were widely condemned. It shows how Turkey's stance was perceived on the world stage.
Right. Let's move into that darker aspect now, the attacks themselves. This is where ASALA becomes known and feared. Give us an overview.
Between 1975 and the late 1980s, ASALA conducted a sustained campaign of violence. Their attacks, mostly bombings and assassinations, are documented to have killed 46 people and injured nearly 300 more.
And who are the primary targets?
Initially, and primarily throughout their campaign, the targets were Turkish diplomats and government officials stationed abroad. They claimed responsibility for over 50 bombings alone.
And the first acknowledged attack?
That was the assassination of the Turkish ambassador to Austria, Danish Tunalagil, in Vienna, October 22, 1975, right after their formation.
Setting the tone immediately. Some of their operations were incredibly audacious, weren't they? Like the Paris consulate attack in '81.
The Van operation, yes. September 1981. ASALA-Militants seized the Turkish consulate in Paris, holding 56 hostages.
For how long?
For 15 tense hours.
Uh-huh.
Their demands included the release of political prisoners held in Turkey, not just Armenians.
Yeah.
They specified Turkish and Kurdish prisoners too, and some clergy.
And this played out very publicly.
Hugely. It dominated French television news. And quite remarkably, during the trial of the militants afterwards, there was a degree of public sympathy expressed for them in France. Prominent figures, like the film director Henri Verneuil, Mélanie Manouchian, the widow of a French resistance hero, they spoke out in support.
That is surprising. It speaks volumes about the complex feelings around the Armenian cause in France at the time.
It really does. It suggests the narrative of historical injustice resonated with some, even when confronted with hostage-taking.
But ASALA's tactics didn't always remain so focused, did they? There seems to have been a shift towards less discriminate violence later on.
That's a crucial point. The attack on Esenboga Airport in Ankara, Turkey's capital, on August 7, 1982, marked a major and highly controversial escalation.
What happened there?
Two ASALA militants attacked the airport's international terminal, opening fire in a crowded passenger waiting area and detonating a bomb.
Targeting civilians directly.
Yes, for the first time on such a scale. The attack resulted in 9 deaths and 82 injuries. It was brutal and indiscriminate.
A line crossed, clearly.
Definitely. And significantly, even one of the captured militants, Levan Ekmektian, publicly condemned the massacre during his trial. He appealed to ASALA to stop the violence.
Even one of the perpetrators saw it as wrong.
It suggests internal unease, perhaps, about this shift in tactics. It's often a critical moment for groups like this. When violence becomes indiscriminate, they risk losing support, even legitimacy in the eyes of some who might have sympathized previously.
And the reaction inside Turkey must have been immense.
Intense anger and grief. And tragically, it led to another awful event. A Turkish citizen of Armenian descent, Artan Penik, publicly set himself on fire in Istanbul's Taksim Square to protest the Esenboga attack.
Oh, that's horrific, self-immolation in protest.
The heartbreaking act, it just underscores the terrible, complex web of suffering caused by this cycle of violence, affecting people far beyond the immediate targets.
This move towards targeting civilians, it seems like it had major consequences for ASALA itself, didn't it? Especially after the Orly Airport bombing the following year.
The Orly Airport attack near Paris, July 15, 1983. That was another devastating bombing. At a Turkish Airlines check-in counter, 8 people were killed, 55 injured. Crucially, most of the victims were not Turkish.
So passengers of various nationalities.
Exactly. And this attack proved to be a breaking point internally for ASALA. It led to a major split.
A fracture within the organization.
Yes. The group essentially broke into 2 main factions. One, led by Hagopian, became known as ASALA-Militant, or ASALA-M. They basically doubled down, disregarding civilian casualties. The other faction, led by Monty Melkonian, a quite famous figure in Armenian circles, became ASALA-Mouvement Revolutionnaire, or ASALA-Meller.
And Melkonian's faction disagreed with the indiscriminate attacks.
Strongly. Melkonian argued that attacks should only target Turkish state representatives and institutions, that killing non-combatants was wrong and strategically damaging. Hagopian's faction, meanwhile, reportedly even executed members who dissented.
So the violence turned inwards as well. That must have severely weakened them.
Undoubtedly. Internal conflict is often fatal for groups like this.
And what about the French reaction to Orly? You mentioned potential sympathy earlier. That must have evaporated.
Completely. If there ever was any kind of tacit understanding, theories that France tolerated ASALA's presence as long as they didn't attack French interests, Orly shattered it. The French police launched a crackdown, arrests were made. It signaled a definitive end to any perceived leniency.
The gloves came off, so to speak.
Pretty much. While France might have seen temporary halts in ASALA activity before in exchange for prisoner releases or other concessions, Orly was different. The scale and indiscriminate nature of it changed the game.
And ASALA interacted with other European governments too, right? Negotiating or making demands?
Yes, there were interactions, particularly with Switzerland and Italy, sometimes involving negotiations for releasing imprisoned members. For instance, attacks in Switzerland reportedly stopped temporarily on a couple of occasions while negotiations over prisoners were ongoing. There was even a Swiss judge who expressed some level of understanding for the Armenian historical context, which caused a stir.
Really?
Yeah. And in Italy, reports suggest ASALA might have agreed to halt attacks there in exchange for Italy closing down offices that facilitated Armenian immigration, which ASALA opposed.
It's such a tangled story of violence, diplomacy, backroom deals. Incredibly complex.
It really is.
Now, if you're finding this deep dive as compelling as we are, just a quick reminder to hit that subscribe button. We explore fascinating, often overlooked stories like this all the time here on Tell Me More, and we wouldn't want you to miss out.
Definitely worth subscribing.
So after the mid-'80s split and the international crackdown, ASALA's activities started to wind down.
Significantly, yes. The frequency and scale of attacks decreased. The last attack ASALA formally claimed responsibility for was in 1991, an unsuccessful attempt on the Turkish ambassador in Budapest.
Well, unsuccessful.
Yes, the ambassador wasn't harmed. There was a later bombing in 1997 at the Turkish embassy in Brussels, where perpetrators claimed to be from ASALA. But the organization itself hadn't really shown coordinated activity for years by that point.
So essentially fading out by the early 90s. Throughout their peak years, Turkey constantly accused other countries of helping ASALA. Who was in their sights?
Turkey pointed fingers at several states, accusing them of providing safe haven, training, funding, or just political encouragement. The main targets of these accusations were Cyprus, Greece, Syria, Lebanon, where they were based, of course, and even the Soviet Union.
Did those countries admit to anything?
Officially, no. They all publicly distanced themselves from ASALA and condemned the violence. But the accusations certainly didn't help regional relations, added another layer of tension.
And the violence, sadly, had repercussions within Turkey itself for the Armenian community there, right?
Tragically, yes. There were instances of backlash from Turkish nationalists against Armenian citizens and institutions in Turkey. A notable example was the bombing of the Armenian Apostolic Patriarchate Church in Istanbul.
Retaliation against the community.
Exactly. And the state sometimes reacted harshly, too. An Armenian priest, Father Manuel Yergesin, was arrested in Turkey on charges of having links to ASALA charges widely seen as baseless. Amnesty International actually recognized him as a prisoner of conscience.
Just caught in the crossfire.
It's a grim reminder that the consequences of this kind of conflict ripple outwards in often devastating ways.
Now, interestingly, Israel apparently saw the situation through a specific geopolitical lens.
That's a fascinating side note. Israel consistently condemned ASALA's attacks against Turkish targets. They used it as an opportunity to emphasize a shared threat, both Israel and Turkey being targeted by terrorism, and tried to foster closer security cooperation with Turkey based on that shared experience.
Using ASALA as a sort of diplomatic leverage with Turkey?
You could see it that way, yes. Building common ground against a perceived common enemy.
And one more point on legacy before we move to the counteroffensive, the monument in Yerevan.
Ah, yes. In 2000, a monument titled In Memory of Killed ASALA Commandos was opened in Yerevan, the capital of Armenia. The opening ceremony was even attended by a prominent Greek anti-fascist leader.
That's quite something. A public monument to ASALA members.
It speaks volumes about the contested legacy, doesn't it? How they are remembered very differently in different circles. Heroes to some, terrorists to others. That monument makes that divide very visible.
Definitely. Okay, let's turn to how Turkey and others fought back. After the Esenboga attack, Turkey's stance hardened considerably, didn't it?
It did. Following Esenboga in 1982, Turkey's president at the time, Kenan Evren, gave a clear order: eliminate ASALA. The task fell primarily to Turkey's national intelligence organization, the MAT.
So a state-sanctioned counter-operation was launched.
A serious, covert counteroffensive.
And this involves some pretty shadowy fight, as I understand. Abdullah Satla is a name that often comes up.
Yes, Métis operations against ASALA, particularly in Europe, reportedly involved controversial individuals like Abdullah Shatla. He was a known ultranationalist militant involved in organized crime, even drug trafficking. A very murky figure.
Using contract killers, essentially.
That's what the reports suggest. Mati allegedly tasked him with leading assassination squads targeting ASALA members in France and Lebanon. Though it's worth saying, not all these planned operations were successful. Some failed, some details remain disputed. It's a very opaque part of the story.
And the fate of Levon Ekmekcian, the Esenboga attacker who condemned the violence?
Ekmekcian was captured after the attack. Reports suggest he confessed under duress, providing information about ASALA's structure and plans, possibly after being promised his comrades wouldn't be harmed.
But that promise wasn't kept.
No. He was put on trial, sentenced to death, and despite his repentance and appeal for ASALA to stop, he was executed in January 1983.
A grim end.
A very grim illustration of the ruthlessness on both sides by that point.
And the biggest blow to ASALA's leadership came a few years later, didn't it?
The assassination of the founder, Hagopian, in Athens in 1988. He was gunned down outside his home.
Who was responsible?
It's never been definitively proven, but suspicion immediately fell on Turkish intelligence, the MKT, possibly working with factions opposed to Hagopian. Turkish sources certainly consider his death as marking the effective end of ASALA as a coherent threat.
So this combination of internal splits, like the one after Orly, and this external pressure, the counteroffensive, it really took its toll.
Absolutely. It crippled the organization.
How was ASALA viewed officially on the world stage during this period? Was it formally labeled a terrorist group?
Yes, widely. The U.S. Department of State explicitly classified ASALA as a terrorist organization. Other Western intelligence agencies, like the CIA, monitored them closely and considered them a significant international threat in the early 80s. The European Parliament also linked them with allied groups, like the new Armenian Resistance.
So internationally condemned and classified as terrorists, but you mentioned investigations into their attacks often didn't lead anywhere.
That's one of the puzzling aspects. Despite the high profile of many attacks in Western Europe, the majority of police investigations reportedly remained inconclusive. Few perpetrators were brought to justice, beyond those caught practically red-handed, like in Paris or Orly.
Why was that? Lack of evidence. Intelligence failures.
Probably a combination of factors. The covert nature of the group operating across borders, potential lack of cooperation between intelligence agencies, maybe even deliberate obstruction in some cases. It's hard to say definitively. But it is striking how many cases went cold. Australia even reopened its investigation into the 1980 assassinations of Turkish diplomats there decades later.
Fascinating. What about their support networks? You mentioned Palestinian groups early on. Did that continue?
That support structure was severely damaged by external events. The 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon, targeting the PLO, massively disrupted ASALA's bases and training facilities there. That was a huge blow.
Losing their safe haven.
Essentially, yes. And then, in 1983, relations with Palestinian groups soured significantly. Key groups, including the PLO itself, reportedly withdrew their support entirely.
Why the withdrawal?
Likely a combination of factors. The indiscriminate nature of attacks like Orly probably played a part, making ASALA too much of a liability. There were even reports that Palestinian groups shared intelligence about ASALA operatives with French authorities after 1983.
A complete turnaround.
A major shift in alliances. And financial support was drying up too.
From the Armenian diaspora.
Yes. While diaspora support, financial and moral, was likely crucial early on, the Orly attack in particular is thought to have alienated many potential donors. The killing of non-Turks was just too much for many to stomach.
So it seems like a perfect storm hitting them in the early to mid-'80s.
Exactly. The Israeli invasion disrupting their base, the internal split after Orly, the loss of Palestinian allies, dwindling financial support from the diaspora, Hagopian's assassination later on. It was a confluence of factors that led to their fragmentation and decline.
Making their eventual fade out almost inevitable.
It appears so. While, as we said, there were sporadic claims or incidents into the 90s, the cohesive, active organization largely ceased to exist after the late 1980s.
Before we wrap up and think about the takeaways, let's just briefly touch on how ASALA communicated its message. They weren't just about attacks, were they? They had publications.
That's right. They had an active information branch. They published books, pamphlets, posters, trying to justify their actions and promote their political vision.
And their main publication.
It was a multilingual periodical called Hayazdan, which simply means Armenia. It ran with some interruptions from 1980 potentially up to 1997.
What kind of content did it have?
It featured political analysis from their perspective, military communiques claiming responsibility for attacks, ideological articles. It was distributed for free within Armenian communities globally.
Did it have like a motto or slogan?
It did. Two main ones often appeared. The armed struggle and right political line are the way to Armenia, and Viva, the revolutionary solidarity of oppressed people.
Really encapsulates their ideology, doesn't it?
Perfectly. Armed struggle plus leftist solidarity.
Yeah.
They also had sister publications in places like London and Paris.
And did their actions and the whole underlying struggle filter into wider culture at all?
It did, in various ways. We mentioned the support from figures like Verneuil in France. In Armenia itself, a prominent poet, Silva Kaputikian, wrote a well-known poem dedicated to Levon Ekmektian after his execution.
The Esenboga attacker.
Wow. Shows the complexity of his legacy, too. And perhaps most interestingly, a Spanish journalist, José Antonio Gurriaran. He was actually wounded, blinded in one eye by an ASALA bomb attack in Madrid.
Injured by them.
Yes. But instead of just condemning them, he became fascinated by their motivations. He sought them out, interviewed ASALA members, and wrote a book about them called La Bomba the Bomb, trying to understand why they did what they did.
That's an incredible turn, from victim to investigator.
A remarkable example of trying to grapple with the roots of political violence, even when personally affected by it.
Okay, this has been a really comprehensive journey through a complex and often disturbing history. Bringing it all together, what are the main things you think we should take away from the story of ASALA?
Well, for me, it's a powerful, if troubling, illustration of how deep historical trauma, like the Armenian Genocide and its denial, can persist, and, when combined with political frustration, fuel radical movements generations later.
The past isn't dead, as they say.
It's not even past sometimes. ASALA's story is a stark reminder of what can happen when peaceful avenues for addressing historical grievances seem closed off or ignored for too long.
And the specific nature of ASALA is also striking. This militant group formed almost entirely within the diaspora, thousands of miles from the homeland they sought to liberate or reclaim.
Exactly. That makes it a fascinating, maybe unique case study in transnational political violence, how a diaspora community attempts to exert influence violently in this case, on a nation-state from afar. It raises all sorts of questions about identity, loyalty, and the consequences of such actions.
And those consequences were often tragic, not just for the targets, but for others too, leading to those internal divisions we discussed.
Absolutely. The split within ASALA, particularly after the Orly attack damaged non-Turkish civilians, really highlights the immense ethical and strategic dilemmas these kinds of groups face. Where do you draw the line? What violence is acceptable or effective? And what becomes counterproductive or morally indefensible, even by their own logic?
Difficult questions with no easy answers. This has been incredibly insightful. Thank you for guiding us through it all.
My pleasure. It's a story that deserves careful consideration.
And thank you, everyone, for joining us for this deep dive here on Tell Me More Stories Told as podcasts.
Before you go, maybe just one final thought to leave you with.
Right.
ASALA as an active organization might belong to the past now, but the core issues that fueled it, the debate over historical recognition of the Armenian Genocide, unresolved territorial disputes, the legacies of violence in that region, they haven't gone away.
Still very relevant today.
Very much so. So the question maybe becomes, how do these long shadows of history continue to shape the present and the Caucasus and beyond? And looking forward, what alternative paths might exist towards reconciliation, towards justice, that don't involve repeating the cycles of violence we discussed today? Something to ponder.